Chapter 2 Lost in Translation. Pulling on Hagrid's comically oversized dragonhide gloves, Ariel used the tongs by the fireplace to gently prod the egg nestling in the flames. When she rested the metal against the shell, she could feel the egg nudge against the tongue, making small pecking sounds as the little one struggled to break free. The faint tear along the side of the eggshell elongated, and Ariel glanced worriedly towards the door. If Hagrid didn't return soon, he'd miss the hatching. Hagrid had taken his dog for another walk, as Fang's nervous bladder didn't wait for any egg to hatch, no sir. Not that Ariel blamed the boarhound. He was hardly the only one with heightened anxiety these days. Ariel had barely slept, while Hagrid wasn't eating enough. To accommodate the egg, the temperatures within the hut were so high it wasn't healthy for Fang to be here anymore either. Initially, Ariel suggested she could take Fang out, but someone had to stay with the egg, and Hagrid deemed it safer to lock her in his overheated wooden house with a fire-breathing dragon than risk her running into the locals around here. The fact she kind of agreed really punctuated how dire the situation was. Not the least because the people living around here were odd. Though they were all muggles, they dressed even stranger than wizards and witches did. During their first meeting with the locals, there had been a communication mishap, and next several of the strangers drew weapons on them. Of all the peculiar things to happen to Ariel this year, being aimed at with a bow and arrow still seemed the weirdest thing to happen yet. Well, perhaps not. Ariel only just learned she was a witch, and famous, and been sent to a magical school, and she'd been displaced through mysterious magic. So maybe it was the second strangest? Or third? At least somewhere in the top 10. It had been a very strange year. Fortunately, it hadn't gone further than threatening behavior, though it hadn't been easy to convince the strangers that it didn't mean any harm, mostly because of the language barrier. Neither Ariel or Hagrid had the foggiest what language these people spoke, and no one around here knew English either. It made communication nearly impossible. At long last, Ariel heard heavy footsteps approaching the hut. Finally! She'd seriously started fearing she'd have to hatch this dragon alone. The keys clacked before the lock clicked and the door opened. Hagrid! Ariel turned quickly to tell him the exciting news, but she caught sight of his face. The words died on her lips. He'd been crying again. Hagrid tried to hide it by ducking his head and walking straight for the wooden chest next to his bed, flipping the lid open. "Come on, boy. Go inside. It'll be cool and comfortable down there for you," Hagrid said, gesturing for Fang to get inside the wooden box. The first time she'd seen Hagrid put his dog in a chest had been confusing. Since Ariel had been to Hagrid's hut so many times for tea, she thought she knew his home. After all, it only took a single glance to see that Hagrid's hut only had one room inside. Hams and pheasants were hanging from the ceiling. There was an open fireplace, and in the corner stood a massive bed with a worn wooden chest at its side. Ariel had never thought of the worn wooden chest as anything more before Hagrid opened the lid, revealing a winding staircase spiraling down towards a deeper level with 3 whole extra rooms. "What? I didn't know you had a basement, Hagrid," Ariel marveled the first time she saw it, hurrying down the creaking steps after Hagrid. "Ah, it doesn't. Right now we're inside the chest." "We are?" Ariel gaped. "How?" "It's got an extendable charm on it. Makes tiny spaces larger. Anyway, I couldn't fit a bathroom or proper storage up in the hut, so Professor Dumbledore fixed this for me. I don't think anyone but you've been down here before, though." "No, wait. Professor Sprout fetched some stuff for me storage once. She needed to borrow some acromantula silk, and I've got loads." "Oh," Ariel said. This made a bit more sense than assuming Hagrid used the bathroom facilities up at the castle. That had been during day 1. They were now on day 7, and there hadn't been much to smile about since. Are you alright, Hagrid?" Ariel said. With a little hiccup, Hagrid shut the lid of the wooden chest and sniffed into his handkerchief. "No, the flu isn't working. The Ministry doesn't react to your underage magic, and none of me old communication tools works anymore. And the stars are all off. I don't know what to do anymore, Ariel. I don't like this one bit." "Me neither." Ariel glanced out of the window. Despite a week straight of clear night skies and extraordinary bright stars, Neither Hagrid or Ariel could find the constellations, Canis Major, Carina, Orion, Ursa Major or any of the rest. It was like a completely different sky. The last week had been harrowing, and the severity of their situation had her chest tightening and her stomach rolling. Ariel had missed a week of school, and though her attendance record wasn't anywhere near her biggest concern, the time span felt significant. Not only had Hagrid and Ariel failed to find anyone, but everyone else had failed to find them too. Now that week signified a milestone crossed, a milestone passed, a week away from Ron and Hermione, from the towering castle, from sessions reading in the library, from meals in the Great Hall and Quidditch training. How was Hedwig doing? Would the school care for her? If not, Hermione had always liked Ariel's beautiful snowy owl, and hopefully she'd take care of Hedwig until they came home. Once they returned, Ariel swore to spoil Hedwig rotten with as many owl treats as she could stomach. She'd make Aunt Petunia's diddly cuddling look like strict parenting. "Come here, Hagrid, I think you came back just in time," Ariel said, and with gloved hands reached into the fire and grabbed the wiggling egg. "Look at it. It's cracking and moving, just like the book said. I think it'll be out soon." "What?" All at once it was like the strain of the last week fell off his shoulders, and Hagrid hurried forward with a renewed burst of energy. "Oh, look at that! You're right! The baby's coming!" Carefully, Ariel placed the egg on the table and together they sat down to watch it hatch. Not 5 minutes later, there was a scraping noise and the egg split open. The baby dragon flopped onto the table while Ariel gasped and Hagrid laughed. "Isn't he beautiful?" Hagrid crooned, a tear rolling down his cheek. That's debatable, Ariel thought. The little dragon had large spiny wings, a skinny body, long snout, and small bumpy horn stubs. He crawled around the table with reptile movements, his bulging yellow eyes with slitted pupils taking in his surroundings. "He's brilliant, Hagrid," Ariel said, "because even if he wasn't beautiful, it was a dragon, and a dragon didn't need to be pretty to be fascinating." Hagrid reached out to stroke the dragon's head. It snapped at his fingers, showing pointed fangs. "Bless him! Look! He knows his mummy! My boy, what a beauty you are!" The dragon sneezed, sending sparks shooting from his snout. Ariel wished Ron and Hermione had gotten to see this too. He studied the dragon with odd curiosity, knowing his color would mature as the scales grew in, and yet... I thought it would be born pale beige, like the book said about Hungarian horntails. Ariel had pored over Hagrid's dragon books throughout the week, and even practiced some of the spells they'd recommended for safe dragon rearing. This hatchling looked enough like a horntail baby in shape, but the cold greyish color that almost had a bluish tint to it wasn't as described as in the book. It's just cause he's a mixed breed," Hagrid said. "But which two breeds is he a mix of exactly?" "To tell you the truth, Ariel, I'm not sure. He's definitely got a good chunk of Hungarian horntail in him, but the rest? I haven't the foggiest. I'm hoping it'll be easier to tell when he grows up a bit, though right now we'll need to get some food in him." Right. Ariel's excitement fell slightly. I set aside the fish dinner you didn't finish. Can he eat that?" "Nah, he's too small," Hagrid said. "We'll need to feed him with a bucket of brandy mixed with chicken blood every half hour. That's what they recommended in the book." Ariel blinked. She didn't want to say it, didn't want to sour the mood now that Hagrid was finally smiling again. However... Hagrid, where the hell would we get brandy and chicken blood from? I don't know about you, but I haven't seen any stores around here. And a bucket every half hour? Isn't there something easier to get a hold of? Surely wild mother dragons don't have to brew brandy for their hatchlings. Hagrid chortled. That's actually something I prepared before." He gestured towards his expandable chest. "I didn't know when the egg would hatch, so I stocked up on loads of chicken blood and brandy right after I won the egg. Cause I knew I wouldn't have much time on my hands once he hatched, you know? Anyway, it's still all in the chest, in the pantry down there. Remember to close up behind you though, or else Fang will try to eat it all. We've got to figure out something eventually, but Norbert's meal should be set until he's ready for solids. Norbert? Ariel asked. Yes, I decided to name him Norbert. Suits him, doesn't it? Hagrid said, looking completely besotted while he admired Norbert's attempt to chew his finger off. Holding back a snicker, Ariel stood up while pondering what Hagrid's logic was when he named his sweet but cowardly dog Fang, only to now name a damn dragon Norbert. Honestly, wouldn't it be more fitting if the names were swapped? Ariel grinned, knowing that once they got back home, she and Ron would have a big laugh about it. 3 months later. So perhaps Ariel didn't get to have that laugh with Ron as soon as she thought, but she hadn't lost hope quite yet. Even if it did take a while, Ariel and Hagrid would get home one day. They would. Absolutely. Because surely there was a way home. Or Dumbledore would find them, like Hagrid kept saying. At any rate, Ariel would do her best to keep optimistic until it happened. And in the meanwhile, she simply had to be a bit more realistic about their situation. She'd certainly developed a newfound respect and insight into the saying, necessity is the mother of all invention. Because Merlin wasn't that the truth of it. The last few months had challenged Ariel and Hagrid in ways they'd never experienced, and the adjustments hadn't always gone smoothly. They'd persevered though, and thanks to the assistance of magic combined with a complete disregard of the Statute of Secrecy, all 4 of them were still healthy and well fed. Hagrid, Ariel, Fang and the growing Norbert was rapidly reaching the size of a lion. While his horns and spikes remained the shade of copper characteristic of the Hungarian horntail, his scales were steadily growing into a dark spectre of dusky blue. And though they had a few suspicions, they still weren't sure what sort of mixed breed he was. Since Norbert outgrew the hut within a month, they built him a stone-fenced enclosure right outside the hut. In that time, Ariel and Hagrid had become surprisingly proficient in certain spells, some of which were charms Ariel normally wouldn't have learned for years. But fear-driven urgency proved a powerful motivator. So far, the most useful spell Ariel had learned was the Aquamenti charm, since access to water had been paramount, both for first and because of Norbert, their fire safety hazard of a housemate. It had been followed by the fire-making spell Incendio, then a difficult but nifty flame-freezing charm called Peregnis, that had been popular during the witch burnings in the Middle Ages, since it made fire harmless to touch. When casting the Peregnis charm, Ariel could step into a bonfire without burning, though her clothes didn't fare as well. Currently, she was working on Hermione's favorite Bluebell flames, which could be stored in jars and worked more as portable and permanent sources of light. Though Hagrid could cast a few of these spells with his pink umbrella, Ariel learned most of it from books. That fateful night of their displacement to this strange, foreign place that Ariel had cautiously started calling a different world, if only within the privacy of her own mind, she'd had her school bag with her. Even her father's invisibility cloak had been stuffed into it at the last second. Hagrid also had his old school books from when he'd attended Hogwarts, from his first to 3rd year, as well as a mismatch of different reading materials he'd gathered over his 64 years of life. He'd shown Ariel where to find everything down in the expandable chest, and said in a regretful murmur that since her schooling was disrupted, she was welcome to anything that struck her fancy. "What do you think I should try to learn next, Norbert?" Ariel asked, flipping through Hagrid's old copy of The Standard Book of Spells, Grade 2. That morning Hagrid had left to get food, probably fish, again, and left Ariel to make sure Norbert didn't burn down the hut. The shrinking charm? She glanced over at Norbert. That would certainly be useful on you, right? If you just stayed small, maybe we'd stand a chance of hiding you from that lot. Ariel nodded towards a stretch of steep forest where rocks and buildings popped up between the trees. She put away the book and almost on cue, a light childish giggle reached her ears. A few miles through the forest was a small fishing village, and since it had taken no more than hours between their arrival and getting discovered by an entire hunting party, keeping secret had never been an option. After the first mob left, there had been groups passing by the hut regularly over the last few months, some suspicious, others bordering on causing trouble, all of them curious. Ariel had only ventured to the small fishing village on a couple of trips with Hagrid, and about a dozen times alone under her invisibility cloak. But visible or not, proper communication was nearly impossible because of the language barrier. But that didn't stop people from walking by the hut to gape and point, though there had been a noticeable change. Where there once used to be only men and their dogs, the previous month was the first time Ariel had seen any women passing by their hut, and soon there were children amongst them too. At first Ariel couldn't fathom why, until the obvious answer dawned on her. Of course they were fascinated by the dragon meandering around the hut, and by extension them as well. A giant, a child, a dog, and a dragon. They made for an odd little unit, and Ariel couldn't blame them for their curiosity. Though all of it had Ariel feeling a little like she was part of a zoo exhibition. More laughter carried on the wind, sounding closer than Ariel expected. This time it was a group of younger people. Ariel could see them sticking their heads out from behind the boulders and trees, pointing at Norbert or her, whispering and snickering. If Ariel was to guess, this group might have sneaked off to see the dragon without their parents' permission, since this was the first time she'd seen the kids around the hut without an adult escorting them. Ariel glanced over to Norbert. It was a hot summer day and the dragon was clawing at the ground, growling and snarling at a rock. He flicked his teeth, his long reptile tongue lolling out. There weren't any flames, but the heat of his panted breath caused the air to ripple. Up in the forest, the kids whispered excitedly, and in that moment Ariel had had enough. She didn't want to be on this side of things, and before she could think better of it, Ariel raised her arm and waved up to the group. The voices hushed instantly as they ducked for cover, and only a couple boys dared remain out in the open. The shorter of the two hesitated, but then waved back. Heart thumping faster, Ariel smiled. Hagrid had told her to stay clear of the villagers. The people here weren't like normal muggles at all, and some of the adults had been pretty threatening the few times Hagrid ventured into the village. Yet it had been a long while since Ariel had been around anyone her own age. It was at times like these she missed Ron and Hermione like it was a physical wound. More giggles ran through the forest, and she heard voices speaking in that odd language. To her, it was just a string of sounds that didn't make sense. Yet by now there was a specific word that had been repeated so often that she had a pretty good idea what it meant. While looking at the boy who'd waved to her, Ariel pointed to Norbert and tried to repeat that word. Zealdris is. Ariel grimaced as she butchered the strange word. Zealdris. Yikes, no. It was unexpectedly difficult to force her tongue to twist around the foreign vowels. Zeldri. Zeldrizes. The boy lit up and the hidden group erupted into excited murmurs, too intangible to make out but audible all the same. Slowly but surely the boy made his way down the ridgeside, looking determined as he dared come closer than anyone had before. He was around her own age, with brown hair, a white nose, and dressed in garments Uncle Vernon would call a dress, but which was in fashion between both women and men in these parts. Ariel kept silent until he reached the stone fence Hagrid had set up for Norbert's enclosure. She repeated the word, but laced it with a warning tone. Zeldrizes. He smiled wildly, showing a row of crooked teeth, and fortunately the boy settled for leaning against the fence instead of climbing it. Casa! Zeldrizes! Zeldrizes! He said in a thick voice, staring at Norbert with rapturous curiosity. Zeldrizes. Dragon. Ariel nodded since yes, Norbert was indeed a Zeldrizes. Encouraged by her friendliness, the boy pointed a thumb at himself and said clearly, Chaco. Though uncertain if she understood correctly, Ariel pointed at the boy and repeated the word, name? Chaco? At that, the boy, Iago, lit up, visibly pleased. To finish off introductions, he pointed last to her, waited for Ariel to speak. If she'd guessed the rules of this game right, he was asking her name. Ariel, she told him. Concentrating, Jacko tried her name a few times. Harry. Harry. Hariel. Hariel. Hariel, she confirmed. Leaves rustled in the forests. Earth and gravel shifted under feet as the group of kids started making their way down. Braver now that Yago had tested the waters for them, there were 7 of them total, 5 boys and 2 girls, ranging from around 7 years old to the oldest who was close to Percy's age. They started speaking too much, too soon and nearly all at once, too excited to make themselves understood by a foreigner like herself. Hariel understood they were introducing themselves, pointing at their chest and speaking words, but there were too many words. She couldn't differentiate between what's introduction words and what part of the sentence was supposed to be their names. She tried her best, smiling and happy, despite how overwhelming it was, but in the end she only got one other name, Fera. It was an easy name to remember and the older girl had known to repeat the one word until Hariel had caught it properly. The excited atmosphere and loud chatter was something new and interesting to more than just Hariel though. Norbert had certainly smelled other humans, but this was his first meeting with anyone else but Hagrid, Hariel and Fang. That wasn't dinner. His head jerked up, the scalding hot rock he'd been playing with was discarded in favor of this new curiosity. Norbert stood up on his hind legs and flapped his wings to make himself more imposing. His long curious screech cut through the air, sharp enough to make several stagger back. "Shh, Norbert!" Hariel hushed the dragon, stepping in between the group and Norbert while a flicker of doubt came over her. Maybe this hadn't been such a good idea. Her placement stopped the dragon from using fire, but it didn't stop him from approaching. Crouching down, his long neck arched towards the ground, the dragon shuffled forwards. The kids, scared at once, several screamed and started running, which was about the worst thing they could possibly do. Hariel could see Norbert's predatory instincts kicking in, because when a prey tried to run, a dragon takes flight. "Stop!" Hariel shouted, acting without a thought as she held up her hands to hold him, as if the dragon would magically understand human gestures. In a stroke of luck, Norbert halted in his track, his yellow eyes locked with hers. "Good boy, calm down now," Hariel said, extremely relieved that it worked. They tried to command Norbert countless times before, but this was the first time it had worked. Normally he showed little to no interest in doing anything less than whatever he pleased. Mindful of her movements, Hariel walked up to the dragon's side and reached out with her palm flat. "You want a scratch?" Hariel might have imagined it, but in that moment he felt like more than a beast. She could have sworn there was something like understanding shimmering between those yellow reptilian eyes, as if she was connecting with him better than she'd managed previously. Abruptly, Norbert growled loudly, teeth glistening and tongue flapping. Hariel startled slightly, but then broke into a grin. They were alright as long as he didn't clench his jaw, because a clenched jaw meant biting. A clenched jaw meant heat and fire, but this wasn't that. It'd be hard for anyone else but Hagrid to recognize, but this was just Norbert's version of a loud, toothy laugh. "You just like the attention, don't you?" Hariel chuckled as Norbert allowed her to pet him, tilting his head so she'd scratch just the right spot. Norbert's approach had sent the group scattering, and those brave enough to remain had taken cover. Hariel smiled to Jacko, from where he was peering around a thick trunk, hoping his obvious interest in dragons hadn't been squashed so easily. Maybe she could salvage this. She'd like to learn a few more words in this strange language of theirs. Jacko was looking warily between Norbert and Hariel, but it almost seemed as if it wasn't the dragon he looked most worried about. The oldest boy in the group came up and grabbed Jacko's arm, whispering something. Whatever he said made Jacko follow as the group turned around to leave. "You're going?" Hariel asked, knowing perfectly well he wouldn't understand, but didn't know what else to do. She missed having friends. Hagrid was wonderful and one of the best people she'd ever met, but he was 64 years old and there was only so much they had in common. At her words, Jacko glanced back over his shoulder, but only smiled apologetically, before the other boy dragged him out of sight. Hariel wasn't sure she understood why they'd left so suddenly, but could only assume Norbert charged and her own foreignness was to blame. "It's only natural," she tried to tell herself, even while a nagging feeling told her something wasn't quite right. Why had the kids seemed more wary of Ariel than Norbert when they left? It's not like she'd done magic. Because how was Ariel to know the words flowing out of her mouth? The speech that had suddenly captivated Norbert so, the sound that scared the other kids, wasn't English at all. Ariel had never heard of parcel tongue before, nor did she know she could speak it. That when Norbert's long neck had crouched low and he'd been slinking forwards in an imitation of a slithering snake, it caused her parcel tongue to activate in front of all those children. No, Ariel wouldn't figure that out until later that day, when a simple remark to Norbert had the groundskeeper struck dumb. "Galloping Gorgons! What was the sound out of your mouth?" And that's how both Ariel Potter and Rubeus Hagrid learned she was a parcel mouth. But more importantly, that Norbert was much more receptive to snake speech than any human gibberish.